Jake sat on the edge of the stage, sweat pooling at the back of his neck. The dim, flickering neon sign above him read Comedy Cavern, in a font that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Tonight's crowd, or what little of it there was, had been brutal. Jake's last joke, a pun about cats and existential crises, landed as flat as the stale nachos on the nearest table. "That's my time," he muttered, his voice echoing awkwardly in the nearly empty room. A lone cough from a back corner felt like the final nail in the coffin of his already crumbling career. As Jake trudged off stage, the bartender gave him a pity nod, the kind reserved for lost causes and people who still ordered Long Island iced teas after midnight. Back in his apartment, Jake stared at his cracked laptop screen, scrolling through social media, where comedians with shinier teeth and better management racked up views. "Maybe they're right," he said aloud to the silence. "Maybe I'm just too small for this world." Before he could spiral further, the room lit up like a 4th of July parade. A loud humming noise filled the air, followed by a flash of blinding green light. Jake scrambled backward, knocking over a pile of takeout boxes. Standing in the middle of his living room was a woman, a giant woman, her head nearly brushing the ceiling. She was clad in metallic armor that shimmered like oil on water, her eyes glowing with an unnervingly calm intensity. "Human comedian Jake Reynolds!" she boomed, her voice vibrating through the very walls. Jake blinked, certain he'd fallen asleep in front of some poorly budgeted sci-fi movie. Hi. If this is about the rent, I promise I'll pay next week." The woman ignored him, pulling out a device that looked suspiciously like a tablet scaled for giants. "You have been chosen for the Gigantican Humor Exchange Program. Your unique existence has intrigued our scholars." "Gigantican what now?" Before he could protest, the giantess tapped the tablet, and Jake felt his body lift off the ground as if gravity had taken a coffee break. "Hey! I don't even have a passport!" he yelled, but it was no use. The next thing he knew, he was aboard what looked like a spaceship designed by someone who thought subtlety was a dirty word. The ship was sleek, the floors gleaming, but everything was comically oversized. The chairs looked like they belonged in a theme park, the controls required 2 hands to operate, and even the coffee mugs looked like they could double as bathtubs. Jake stumbled around, trying to get his bearings, when the giantess reappeared. "I am Ziwirala," she announced. "Your guide. Our people have long studied humor as a measure of intelligence and cultural significance. You will now perform for the Gigantican court." Jake snorted. "So, you kidnapped me for an open mic? You could have just sent a really aggressive email." Ziwirala's expression didn't budge. "Humor is an art form we struggle to master. Your presence will help us evolve." "Evolve?" Jake asked, skeptical. "You look like you could crush a car with your pinky. What could I possibly teach you?" Ziwirala tilted her head. "Humor. Subtlety. Resilience. And how to cope with your diminutive stature." Jake stared at her, unsure whether to be insulted or impressed by her audacity. "Diminutive? Lady, I'm average height." "For a child," she retorted, her tone flat. The next hours passed in a blur of introductions, giant aliens gawking at him like he was a novelty act, and being handed an oversized microphone that weighed as much as a toddler. Jake found himself standing before an auditorium filled with towering alien women, their expressions varying from boredom to mild curiosity. "Ladies, and other giant ladies," Jake began, his voice shaky but trying for confident. "I've been asked to perform here tonight because apparently, your planet is in desperate need of humor. So let's start with something universal, dating." The room stayed eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the ship's engines. Jake gulped. "On Earth, we say size doesn't matter, but judging by this crowd, I'm guessing that phrase doesn't fly here." Laughter erupted, not the roaring kind he'd hoped for, but more of a polite titter. Encouraged, he pressed on. "I mean, I've heard of women who like a man with a strong jawline, but here, you guys probably need a guy with a strong scaffolding permit." This time, the laughter was louder, though Jake noticed a few confused faces in the crowd. Ziwirala, sitting in the front row, raised a skeptical eyebrow. He pointed to her. You're looking at me like I just told you I prefer decaf. I get it. You probably think he's too small to satisfy my species, right? A collective gasp filled the room, followed by booming laughter from the back rows. Jake grinned, adrenaline replacing his earlier nerves. Well, let me tell you something. Back on Earth, I'm fun-sized. Perfect for all the rides and easy storage. The laughter grew louder, but Zywirala didn't join in. Instead, she leaned forward, her massive hands clasped. Your humor relies heavily on self-deprecation, she noted. Is that the hallmark of your species? Jake shrugged. It's either that or therapy, and therapy doesn't pay the bills. The performance wrapped up with a smattering of applause, not exactly a standing ovation but far better than Jake had expected. As he stepped off the stage, Zywirala approached him, towering over him like a judgmental skyscraper. You're intriguing, she said, her tone grudging. But your work here is far from over. Jake sighed. Great. Just what I needed, alien Yelp reviews. She didn't laugh. Instead, she smirked. Your journey begins now, human. Let's see if your humor can truly reshape our society, or if you'll remain nothing more than a curiosity. Sounds fun, Jake said, already wondering what he'd gotten himself into. But just so we're clear, I'm going to need a normal-sized bed. Zywirala turned on her heel, muttering something about humans and their incessant need for comfort, leaving Jake to wonder whether his comedic career had finally taken off, or if he just traded one impossible audience for another. Jake slumped into the alien-sized chair in what he assumed was some kind of green room, though it looked more like a palace chamber for someone who liked their furniture carved out of stone. He couldn't tell if he was sweating from the performance, or from the sheer effort it took to climb up onto the absurdly oversized chair. Either way, he was exhausted, his confidence hanging by a thread. Just as he began to close his eyes, the door swung open, and Zywirala entered, her towering frame casting a long shadow. You've caused a stir, she said, her voice flat as always, but with a faint trace of curiosity. Your performance was adequate. Wow, stop, you'll make me blush, Jake replied, wiping his forehead dramatically. So what's next? Do I get a trophy for being adequate, or is this where you tell me I'm being fed to some alien monster for not meeting expectations? Zywirala ignored his sarcasm and handed him what looked like an alien version of a tablet. You'll need to study our customs if you plan to survive another performance. Your audience will only grow larger, and humor alone will not be enough. You must understand us. Jake took the tablet, scrolling through its contents. It was a dense collection of text, diagrams, and cultural notes, all written in a language that somehow translated itself in real time. He skimmed over sections about their obsession with size as a measure of status, their highly regimented societal structure, and their literal interpretations of almost everything. He couldn't help but snort at one entry about clothing protocols, which included diagrams for their impractically elaborate outfits. So let me get this straight, Jake said, glancing up. You guys are obsessed with size, but you can't figure out pockets? Zywirala's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. Practicality is secondary to appearance, she replied. But your point is not without merit. Wow, did I just get a compliment from the giantess who kidnapped me? Jake smirked, leaning back in the chair. Careful, or I might start thinking you like me. Zywirala's expression hardened, though her cheeks flushed a subtle shade of violet. Do not mistake my observations for admiration, she said stiffly. Your humor is intriguing, but your physical stature remains lacking. Jake laughed, shaking his head. You really know how to make a guy feel special, don't you? He turned his attention back to the tablet, scrolling through more entries. So, if size is everything here, what's the deal with the humor program? How does that fit into your bigger better philosophy? Zywirala hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, she said, Our society values strength, dominance, and perfection. But we've come to realize that such values, left unchecked, lead to stagnation. Humor is seen as a potential disruptor. It challenges norms and exposes flaws, albeit in a way that is palatable. Jake nodded slowly, starting to piece things together. So you brought me here to roast your society until you guys lighten up. Bold move, I'll give you that. Not exactly, Ziwirala replied. We brought you here to determine if humor can serve as a tool for evolution. If it fails, your presence here will be re-evaluated. Cool, no pressure, Jake muttered, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. So what happens if I bomb again? Do I get sent back to Earth, or is there, like, an alien death ray with my name on it? Ziwirala tilted her head, her expression unreadable. That depends on how much you amuse the council. Jake groaned, running a hand through his hair. Great. Just what every comedian dreams of, life or death stand-up gigs. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jake spent hours studying the tablet's contents, jotting down notes and testing out jokes on Ziwirala, who remained frustratingly stoic no matter what he said. He discovered that the Giganticans had an almost childlike literalism when it came to language, which opened up a treasure trove of potential material. So, let me get this straight, he said during one late-night brainstorming session. You guys think the phrase break a leg means someone should actually fracture a limb before they perform? Naturally, Ziwirala replied. It would be an act of dedication to one's craft. Jake stared at her for a long moment, then burst out laughing. You're killing me, Ziwir. Seriously, this stuff writes itself. By the time his next performance rolled around, Jake felt a strange mix of nerves and excitement. The venue was larger this time, an enormous amphitheater packed with thousands of Giganticans. The stakes were higher, but so was his determination. He stepped onto the stage, gripping the oversized microphone like it was a lifeline. Good evening, Gigantica, he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. I gotta say, this place is growing on me. Mostly because everything here is the size of a small country. The audience chuckled, a low rumble that vibrated through the amphitheater. Encouraged, Jake launched into his material, weaving together observations about their culture with sharp, self-deprecating humor. He joked about their impractical technology. Do you really need a toaster big enough to fit a whole cow? Their obsession with size. Back on Earth, we call this overcompensating. And their literal interpretations of idioms. I told Ziwirala to hang tight, and she spent 20 minutes gripping a rope. The laughter grew louder with each punchline, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to drown him. Jake could hardly believe it. He was killing it. Even Ziwirala, seated in the front row, cracked a small smile, though she quickly tried to hide it. As the set came to a close, Jake took a deep breath and delivered his final joke. You know, they say size doesn't matter, but after spending a week here, I'm starting to think you guys missed that memo. Still, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that humor isn't about how big you are, it's about how big you think. And trust me, I think pretty damn big. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound almost deafening. Jake grinned, his confidence soaring. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged, not just on stage, but in this strange, oversized world. As he stepped off the stage, Ziwirala approached him, her expression a mix of approval and something he couldn't quite place. You've exceeded expectations, she said. But do not grow complacent. The hardest challenges are yet to come. Jake smirked, tucking the microphone under his arm like a trophy. Bring it on, Ziwir. I'm just getting started. Jake leaned against the railing of the balcony in his quarters, staring out at the alien city bathed in shimmering lights. The glow of the buildings was almost hypnotic, but his mind buzzed with thoughts far from serene. He'd pulled off 2 performances that hadn't just kept him alive, they'd started to shift something in this rigid society. The weight of that realization hung heavy, and for once, Jake wasn't sure if he was cracking jokes to cope or because it was all he had. Behind him, Ziwirala entered, her towering form moving with a grace that belied her size. You've become a sensation, she said, her tone still measured but carrying a note of something Jake couldn't quite name. Admiration? Curiosity? The council is beginning to take notice. Not sure if that's a good thing. Jake replied without turning around. Not really a fan of being the guy who accidentally starts revolutions. I mean, do I get a t-shirt at least? Your humor has struck a chord, she continued, ignoring his attempt at levity. But it's also challenged traditions that some hold sacred. The council may not be as amused as the general populace. Jake turned to face her, arms crossed. Let me guess. If I make the wrong joke, they'll reevaluate my presence again, right? Zywirala tilted her head, her expression softening. You underestimate your impact, Jake. Humor is not just entertainment here, it's a weapon. A subtle one, but a weapon nonetheless. Yeah, well, nobody told me I'd be signing up to be a revolutionary comedian, Jake muttered. I'm just a guy who got booed out of his last gig on Earth. And yet here you are, Zywirala said, stepping closer. A human in a world that dismisses your kind as insignificant, proving that size is not the only measure of worth. Jake let out a bitter laugh. Coming from the woman who started our relationship by calling me too small to matter. Zywirala's cheeks flushed that faint violet again, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw a crack in her impenetrable exterior. Perhaps I was hasty in my judgment, she admitted, the words clearly difficult for her to say. Jake grinned, leaning back against the railing. Well, I'll take that as an apology. Sort of. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud chime, signaling the arrival of a message on the oversized screen in the corner of the room. Zywirala glanced at it, her expression immediately hardening. The council has summoned you, she said, her voice losing any trace of warmth. They wish to see your comedic prowess firsthand. Jake groaned. Fantastic. Nothing like telling jokes to a bunch of humorless overlords to really boost the confidence. As they prepared for the performance, Zywirala seemed more tense than usual. Jake couldn't help but poke at her, partly out of curiosity and partly because it was just too easy. You worried about me embarrassing you in front of the bigwigs? He asked, adjusting his jacket, which had been custom-made to fit after his first show. Or are you just worried they won't laugh? Zywirala shot him a glare that could have melted steel. I am concerned for your safety, Jake. The council does not take kindly to ridicule, even in jest. Well, that's kind of a problem, considering ridicule is my entire act, Jake said with a shrug. But hey, if I bomb, maybe I'll finally get some peace and quiet. Her glare softened, replaced by something almost fond. You are insufferable, she said, but there was no malice in her voice. And yet you keep hanging around, Jake quipped, flashing her a grin. Admit it, ZYR, you'd miss me if I was gone. Zywirala didn't respond, but the flicker of emotion in her eyes was enough to tell Jake he wasn't entirely wrong. The council chamber was unlike anything Jake had seen before, even on this planet. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, with towering pillars that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky and an audience of the most powerful figures in Gigantican society seated in a semicircle, their expressions as unyielding as stone. Jake stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding but his face betraying none of it. He'd always been good at hiding nerves. It was practically a job requirement for a comedian. Gripping the oversized microphone, he cleared his throat and began. Good evening, honored council members, he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. I gotta say, this is the fanciest room I've ever bombed in. I mean, back on Earth, the best I could hope for was a club with decent lighting and a bartender who didn't water down the drinks. Silence. Jake's palms started to sweat, but he pressed on. So, I've been on your planet for a little while now, and I've gotta say, you guys really go all out with the size thing. Everything here is big, your buildings, your furniture, your egos. A low rumble of laughter rippled through the chamber, faint but unmistakable. Encouraged, Jake leaned into it. Seriously though, I think I've finally figured out why you brought me here. It's not about humor, it's about making you all feel even bigger by comparison. I mean, standing next to me, who wouldn't feel like a giant? This time, the laughter was louder, though the council members remained stoic. Jake decided to take a risk. But here's the thing, size isn't everything. Back on Earth, we have a saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, It's the size of the fight in the dog. Of course, in your case, it's more like, it's not the size of the building, it's whether the building has a door I can actually fit through. The chamber erupted into laughter, even from some of the council members. Jake felt a surge of relief, but also a strange sense of pride. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. As he wrapped up his set, Jake glanced at Ziwirala, who stood off to the side, her expression a mix of pride and something else he couldn't quite place. Maybe he wasn't the only one whose perspective was starting to shift. Jake paced back and forth in his quarters, trying to shake off the lingering adrenaline from his performance before the council. The room felt smaller somehow, though nothing had changed, except him. He'd survived the ultimate test of his comedic prowess, but the pressure hadn't let up. If anything, it was worse now. Every laugh he earned came with the weight of expectation, not just from the aliens but from himself. A faint knock echoed through the room. He smirked, knowing full well who it was. "Come on in, ZYR. No need to be shy. The door's unlocked, barely fits in the frame, but you know, everything here is about dramatic entrances." Ziwirala entered, her usual stoic demeanor softened. For the first time, she seemed unsure. "You performed well," she said, her tone quieter than usual. The council was impressed. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Was that a compliment? From you? Should I write this down? Frame it?" She sighed, folding her arms across her chest. "Do not let it go to your head, human. There is still much work to be done. The council's approval does not equate to societal change. They are resistant, even in the face of humor." "Sounds like my parents," Jake quipped, leaning against the wall. "So what now? More performances? Or are they finally sending me home with a gold star for participation?" Ziwirala hesitated, and for a moment, Jake thought she might actually be nervous. "The council has requested your presence at a summit tomorrow. They wish to discuss your unique perspective on societal norms." Jake snorted. "Great. Another meeting where I'll be the punchline of some oversized joke." Her eyes narrowed, but there was no real anger behind it. "You underestimate your influence. Your humor has begun to ripple through our society in ways we did not anticipate. Even the council cannot ignore it." Jake shrugged, the weight of her words settling over him. "Yeah, well, humor's funny like that. It sneaks up on you, makes you think when you're least expecting it." The summit was unlike anything Jake had encountered so far. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation, though the stakes felt just as high. The room was filled with towering figures of authority, all of them scrutinizing him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to thinly veiled skepticism. "So," Jake began, adjusting the oversized mic on the table in front of him, "I hear you guys want to talk about humor. Lucky for you, I've got plenty of time and no filter." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but the tension remained thick. One of the council members leaned forward, their voice booming. "Your performances have been enlightening. But we failed to see how humor can lead to progress." Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Okay, let me put it this way. Humor isn't just about making people laugh. It's about shining a light on the stuff nobody wants to talk about. It's like holding up a mirror, but instead of saying, 'Hey, look at your reflection,' you're saying, 'Hey, look at how ridiculous this is.'" He paused, letting his words sink in. "Take your obsession with size, for example. You guys measure everything by how big it is, your buildings, your titles, even your egos. But what's the point of all that size if it's just hiding insecurities?" The room fell silent, and for a moment, Jake thought he might have gone too far. Then, unexpectedly, Ziwirala spoke. "What he says has merit," she said, her voice steady. "Our obsession with size has blinded us to other values: creativity, adaptability, resilience. These are qualities we see in him, despite his stature." Jake smirked, glancing at her. "Was that a backhanded compliment? I'll take it." The conversation continued, with Jake weaving humor and sincerity into his responses. He joked about their impractical technology. Who needs a toaster the size of a spaceship? And their rigid societal rules. You guys have so many protocols, I'm surprised you don't need permission to laugh. But he also spoke earnestly about the power of humor to break down barriers, to make people question the status quo without feeling attacked. By the end of the summit, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was genuine now, not just polite chuckles, and even the most skeptical council members seemed to be considering his words. As the room began to empty, Jake leaned over to Ziwirala, his voice low. So, did I pass the test, or am I still one bad joke away from getting booted out of here? She regarded him with a rare softness in her eyes. You have done more than pass. You have sparked something I did not think possible, a willingness to change. Jake let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Man, all this from a guy who couldn't even get a gig at his hometown comedy club. Who'd have thought? Later that evening, as they walked through the city, Ziwirala seemed unusually quiet. Jake nudged her lightly. What's on your mind, Ziwire? You're not plotting to kidnap another Earth comedian, are you? She shot him a look, but there was no real heat behind it. I am reflecting on how much our society has changed in such a short time. And on how much I have changed. Jake stopped, turning to face her. Change isn't a bad thing, you know. It's scary, sure, but it's also kind of amazing. Ziwirala tilted her head, studying him. You speak as if you are not afraid. But I see through your bravado, Jake Reynolds. Jake chuckled, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, well, fear's part of the package. But that's the thing about humor, it's the best way to deal with it. You laugh at the stuff that scares you, and suddenly it's not so scary anymore. For a moment, they stood in silence, the city's lights casting long shadows around them. Then, unexpectedly, Ziwirala smiled, a real, genuine smile. You are insufferable, she said, but there was warmth in her voice. And yet you keep hanging around, Jake quipped, grinning. Admit it, you'd miss me if I wasn't here. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said more than words ever could. As they continued walking, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of contentment. He'd come to this world as a nobody, a punchline to his own jokes. But now, he was more than that. He was a voice, a catalyst, a comedian who'd found his stage, even if it was on a planet of giants who still didn't fully understand why size didn't matter. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he finally found his place.